The door clicked shut behind me, and a young woman's voice whispered, "Promise me, you will not pass out before I show you this." And in that instant, I understood that my life had already split into a before and an after. I had returned to the restaurant for something trivial. My phone left on the table because my hands had been shaking again, and my mind had wandered as it often did lately. And I told myself this was what aging looked like, a slow leaking away of sharpness and certainty, until you learned to accept smaller days. The dining room was empty chairs, neatly pushed in candles burned down to stubs, and the scent of food still hung in the air. Though I barely registered it anymore, because taste and smell had been slipping from me for months, and doctors had assured me this was normal for a man my age who had worked too hard for too long. Earlier that evening, I had sat across from my child at that same table, watching their face as they studied me with concern that felt rehearsed, their spouse nodding softly in agreement, as if every weakness I displayed confirmed something they had already decided. "You look exhausted," they said gently. And I laughed it off, blaming the long days, the endless responsibility, the weight of a legacy built by my father and his father before him, a life measured not in rest, but in endurance. They spoke about stepping back, about easing my burden, about papers that needed signing soon, because continuity mattered, because stability mattered, because people depended on me, and the words were reasonable enough that I almost felt ashamed for resisting them. I remember lifting my glass and taking a sip, and thinking how strange it was that something I had known intimately for decades now felt flat and distant, like a memory instead of a sensation. And when I frowned, my child reached across the table, touching my wrist with practiced tenderness, saying, "See, this is what I mean. You should not push yourself anymore." The dizziness came when I stood to excuse myself, and the room tilted just enough to make me pause. My hand resting on the back of the chair until the world steadied again, and I told myself it was nothing that everyone sways a little at my age. We finished dinner politely, and I left with hugs and promises to talk again tomorrow, and I truly believed the night was over. Until halfway home, I reached for my phone and felt only empty air and annoyance at myself. When I returned, the parking lot was quiet. The lights dimmed for closing, and I knocked, expecting a tired employee to hand me my device with a smile and an apology. Instead, a young woman opened the door just wide enough to let me in, and then locked it behind me, her eyes wide, not with fear of me, but for me. And she did not ask for my name. She did not mention the phone. She simply said, "Sir, you need to come with me." Her hands trembled as she led me past the darkened dining room toward a narrow hallway that smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old wood, and with every step my unease deepened because nothing about this felt accidental. I asked her what was wrong, and she shook her head once as if words might break something fragile, and said, "I need you to promise me you will not faint, because what I am about to show you is not easy to see." She stopped in front of a small storage room, barely large enough for shelves and boxes, and inside a single monitor glowed casting pale light across the walls, and there on a chair beside it sat my phone exactly where I had left it earlier. My heart began to pound, not with confusion, but with a sudden animal sense of danger, the kind that wakes you from sleep before your mind can explain why. She told me she had noticed things, patterns, small movements, gestures, timing, and that tonight something had finally confirmed what she had been afraid to believe, and she said, "I am sorry, but you deserve to know." The screen flickered and showed the table where I had been sitting less than an hour earlier, and for a moment nothing happened. Just 3 people talking, laughing, clinking glasses, a family scene so ordinary, it almost made me relax. Then I saw myself stand and walk away, and in the space I left behind, everything changed. The young woman beside me inhaled sharply, as if reliving the moment again and again, and I leaned closer to the screen, already knowing in my bones that whatever came next would undo every assumption I had made about my life, my health, my family. The camera caught my child's face as they leaned forward, their expression shifting not to concern, but to focus, and from inside their jacket, a small object appeared. Something smooth, something prepared, and before my mind could protest, they tipped its contents into my glass, with the ease of someone who had done this before. I felt my knees weaken before the footage even finished playing, and the whisper that had stopped me at the door echoed in my head because some truths are not meant to be stumbled upon. They are meant to be braced for. The video did not end with the poison entering my glass, because betrayal rarely stops. At the act itself, it lingers, it performs, it seeks an audience. And as I watched the screen, I realized my absence had given them permission to reveal who they truly were. My child did not rush or glance around nervously. There was no panic in the movement, only familiarity, the kind born of repetition and planning. And when the vial was emptied, they capped it again and slid it back into their jacket with a calm that made my stomach turn. The spouse leaned closer, then shifting their body just enough to block the camera from the dining room angle, and smiled at my child, not with fear or hesitation, but with approval. And in that smile, I saw agreement loyalty to the plan rather than to me. I felt the blood drain from my face, and the room began to narrow as if the walls themselves were closing in, and I reached out blindly for the shelf behind me, because my legs no longer trusted me to stand. On the screen, I returned to the table unaware, smiling faintly, apologizing for taking so long, and I lifted the glass again and drank from it. And my child watched me with anticipation, not concern, and when I grimaced, they exchanged a look that carried relief. What followed was worse than the poisoning itself, because after I looked away, my child exaggerated. Their shoulders hunched, their head trembled. Their mouth slackened in a grotesque imitation of my recent decline, and the spouse laughed quietly, covering their mouth with one hand as if sharing a private joke. I heard a sound escape my own throat, then a low, broken noise I did not recognize as my own, and my knees gave out completely, and I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the cold floor, staring up at a frozen image of my own humiliation. The young woman knelt beside me, saying my name over and over, though I do not remember telling it to her, and she kept apologizing, as if she were the one who had done this, as if guilt might be contagious. I wanted to deny what I had seen, to tell myself. It was a misunderstanding, a trick of angles, anything but the truth. But denial could not survive the clarity of that footage, the ease, the mockery, the shared cruelty. This was not a moment of desperation or a terrible mistake. This was a system, a ritual practiced often enough to become casual, and I understood then that whatever had been happening to my body had not been an accident of age or fate. I asked her how long, and she hesitated before answering quietly that she had noticed strange behavior during several dinners, always when I stepped away, always the same movement, always the same glass, and she had told herself she was imagining things until tonight, when she had checked the recording. She said she could not sleep knowing what she had seen, and that she had waited for me to return, hoping I would, because she did not know how else to reach me without risking everything. I struggled to my feet, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and for a moment the world blurred as dizziness washed over me stronger than ever, and I wondered if the poison was still working even now, laughing at my weakness. The young woman guided me toward the back exit, pressing my phone into my hand, as if grounding me in something real, and the cool night air hit my face, but brought no scent, no relief, only the hollow knowledge that something fundamental inside me had been violated. In the parking lot, I leaned against my car, breathing slowly, trying to piece together the last months, the lost flavors, the fading smells, the medical appointments, the gentle voices telling me this was natural decline, and all of it rearranged itself into a single horrifying pattern. My child had not been preparing to take over my work. They had been preparing to erase me, to reduce me to a cautionary example of age and weakness, while they harvested everything I had built. The young woman asked me what I was going to do, and I could not answer yet, because the shock still clung to me like a heavy coat, and my mind was racing ahead to consequences I was not ready to face. I knew only one thing with absolute certainty. As I stood there under the dim lights, my heart pounding louder than the traffic beyond the lot. This was not a misunderstanding that could be forgiven or explained away. This was a war I had never agreed to fight, but one that had already been declared against me by the person I had once trusted most. And as I drove away from the restaurant, gripping the steering wheel with numb fingers, I understood that my life had not been slipping through my hands. It had been taken deliberately quietly by someone who knew exactly where I was weakest. And for the first time since this began, fear gave way to something else, a cold, focused clarity, because now I knew the truth. And truth, even when it breaks you open, also gives you back the power to stand. By the time I reached home, the shock had settled into something sharper and more dangerous than fear, because fear fades, but clarity does not, and clarity was now pressing against my ribs with every breath. I did not turn on the lights when I entered the house. Instead, I stood in the dark, listening to its familiar silence, realizing how easily I could have vanished inside it, without anyone questioning why. 5 days, that was all I had, and the number repeated itself in my mind like a ticking clock. Because 5 days from now, a meeting was scheduled, one that had been framed as routine, but now revealed itself as a final transfer of power that would leave me legally voiceless. I sat at the edge of my bed and stared at my hands, noticing how thin they looked, how unsteady, and for the first time I wondered how much of that weakness was real and how much had been engineered. The documents they wanted me to sign were waiting already, prepared, printed, bound, and ready for my name, and I realized with a chill that this had never been about helping me rest. It had been about timing, making sure I was confused enough, tired enough, frightened enough to stop asking questions. As the night stretched on, memories began to surface, moments that had felt harmless at the time. Gifts, supplements, drinks pressed into my hand with affectionate insistence, conversations that ended just before I entered the room, glances exchanged when they thought I was not looking. I remembered how the doctors had spoken kindly but vaguely, how tests had been inconclusive, how decline had been suggested as inevitable, and how quickly my child had accepted that explanation, almost relieved by it. Sleep did not come. Instead, I lay there, counting backward from 5, imagining what would happen if I did nothing, imagining myself signing papers I barely understood then. Waking up weeks later, stripped of authority, relocated somewhere quiet and forgettable, while others decided the fate of my life's work. The thought made my chest tighten, not with panic, but with anger. A slow burning heat that cut through the haze that had surrounded me for months. I got up before dawn and moved through the house, touching objects, photographs, tools, books, reminders of decades spent building something meant to last. And I understood that whatever illness I had believed in had robbed me of more than my senses. It had stolen my confidence. 5 days was not much time, but it was enough if I stopped reacting and started thinking, because the people who had done this believed I was already defeated, and that assumption was now their greatest weakness. I made a decision in that quiet hour, not to confront, not to accuse, and not to reveal that I knew anything at all, because knowledge was the only advantage I had left, and I would not waste it on outrage. Instead, I would observe, I would remember, I would test every assumption that had been handed to me, and I would treat my own decline not as a verdict, but as a mystery that needed solving. If they thought I was fading, I would let them believe it. If they thought I was frightened, I would give them that performance, because 5 days could be an eternity when used carefully. As the sun rose, I felt the dizziness again, but this time it did not terrify me. It informed me, it reminded me that whatever was happening inside my body was real and active and therefore measurable. I realized then that the story of my failing health had been written by others, but the truth had not yet been proven, and until it was, nothing was inevitable. 5 days until the meeting, 5 days until everything I had built would either be taken from me or reclaimed by me. And as I stood there, watching light fill the room, I knew that the man who had walked into the restaurant earlier that night, believing he was simply growing old, no longer existed. What remained was someone wounded, but awake, someone betrayed, but thinking. And for the first time since this began, I did not feel like time was running out. I felt like it had finally started moving in my favor. I did not wait for permission from doctors or reassurance from anyone else, because trust once broken does not return easily, and I had learned that my body had been speaking to me all along in a language I had been taught to dismiss. The workspace at the back of the property had been quiet for years, a place where tools gathered dust and old knowledge slept. But as I unlocked the door that morning, something in me steadied, because this was where problems had always been solved, not with hope, but with proof. I moved slowly at first, the dizziness still present, but less frightening now, because I was watching it instead of surrendering to it. And I began by reviewing notes, textbooks, and reference manuals I had not opened in decades, letting familiarity return piece by piece. If my decline had been natural, there would be nothing to find, but if it had been induced, there would be traces, patterns, inconsistencies, something that did not belong, and that thought alone kept me upright when my legs wanted to give in. I examined samples from my own kitchen, from supplements, drinks, residue left in glasses, and what emerged was subtle but unmistakable, a chemical fingerprint that did not match any prescription or nutritional aid I had ever taken. The compound was not lethal. That much was immediately clear because it had been designed with restraint. Its purpose was erosion, not destruction, and the realization made my stomach turn because it meant this had been calculated with patience. Further analysis revealed how elegant the cruelty was. The substance interfered with absorption, quietly draining what the body needed to maintain sensory clarity, while leaving just enough function intact to avoid alarms or emergency intervention. The longer exposure continued, the more convincing the illusion of age-related decline became, and I understood then why every test had come back inconclusive. why every doctor had spoken of inevitability. What stunned me most was what followed when I ran secondary simulations, because once exposure stopped, the damage did not continue. It reversed slowly but steadily, meaning that the prison I had been placed in had never been locked from the inside. I sat down hard, gripping the edge of the table as relief crashed into rage, because this meant my weakness had not been proof of failure. It had been evidence of sabotage. With trembling hands, I began searching the house no longer as a resident, but as an investigator, and what I found confirmed everything. Bottles relabeled. Containers tucked away behind benign packaging items that had entered my home through familiar hands. In a drawer, I found financial documents, not meant for my eyes. Debts, statements, frantic notes, timelines scribbled in haste, and suddenly the question of why no longer lingered, because desperation has a smell, even when you cannot sense it. The numbers were staggering obligations that could not be met without immediate access to everything I owned. And in that moment, my child's sudden urgency made terrifying sense. This had never been about succession or concern or stewardship. It had been about extraction, about turning a lifetime into a lifeline for someone who had already burned through every other option. The final blow came when I uncovered correspondence with a third party, someone who understood chemicals, logistics, timing, someone who had guided this process with professional precision and whose involvement transformed betrayal into conspiracy. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling as the truth settled heavy and complete, because now I knew not only what had been done to me, but how and why, and most importantly, how to stop it. The fear that had followed me for months began to loosen its grip, replaced by something colder and far more dangerous, because once you realize your chains were never permanent, you stop begging to be freed and start planning your escape. I gathered everything, reports, samples, documents, and placed them in order, not with haste, but with care, because every detail mattered now. And as I did, I felt a clarity return that I had not felt in a very long time. They believed I was fading. They believed I was confused. They believed the clock was on their side, and that belief was the mistake that would undo them. For the first time since the night at the restaurant, I allowed myself to think not about survival, but about strategy, because 5 days was no longer a countdown to loss. It was a window, and I intended to use every hour of it. From that morning on, I became an actor in my own life, performing weakness with the same precision that had once gone into my work, because now I understood that the greatest danger was not what they had done, but what they believed about me. I let my hands shake when they watched I moved slowly through rooms I knew by heart. I asked questions twice and pretended not to remember answers, and each small performance fed their confidence like fuel poured onto a fire. They began to visit more often, hovering with concern that no longer bothered to hide its impatience, and every time they spoke about the upcoming meeting, their voices carried an edge of anticipation that made my stomach tighten. Privately, I followed a different routine, measured, careful, deliberate. I stopped taking everything they gave me. I flushed my system and began rebuilding what had been taken from me. And each morning I tested myself quietly, noting what returned first: the faint bitterness of coffee, the dry smell of paper, the metallic tang of water from the tap. Progress was slow, but undeniable, and with it came something even more important: focus, because the fog that had clouded my thoughts for months was lifting, and patterns I had missed before now stood out with painful clarity. I watched how they moved through the house, how they spoke on the phone when they thought I was resting, how they closed doors a little too carefully and lowered their voices a little too late, and I learned more in those days of silence than I ever could have through confrontation. One afternoon, I heard my child pacing outside the study phone pressed to their ear, their voice sharp with urgency, and when they mentioned timelines, transport, and irreversible steps, my heart began to pound, not with fear, but with recognition. They were not waiting for control to be transferred. They were preparing to act immediately after it was theirs, and whatever they planned would erase what little chance I might have had to recover later. That night, I reached out to someone I trusted completely, someone who had stood beside me long before this madness began, and who understood without explanation what it meant to protect something built slowly with care. I told them only what they needed to know, that time was short, that discretion was essential, and that what I asked would place them at risk if discovered, and their answer was immediate and without hesitation. As plans took shape, the tension inside me tightened, because every step forward carried the risk of exposure, and I knew that if they sensed even a hint of resistance, the mask would drop, and whatever restraint they had shown until now would disappear. I continued to play my part. Slumped shoulders, slow speech confusion on cue, and the more convincingly I declined, the bolder they became, leaving documents in plain sight, speaking openly about future changes, assuming I was no longer capable of understanding what I heard. The irony was bitter, but useful, because in their arrogance, they revealed everything. Schedules, contacts, intentions, and I stored each detail away like ammunition waiting for the right moment. On the fourth night, exhaustion caught up with me, and as I lay awake listening to the house settle, I felt the weight of what I was doing, because pretending to fade meant confronting my own mortality in ways I had avoided for years. I thought about the child I had raised, the dreams I had carried for them, the faith I had placed in blood and continuity, and the grief cut deeper than the fear ever had. But grief could wait, because survival demanded clarity. And as dawn approached, I reminded myself that this performance was temporary, that beneath the act, I was still present, still capable, still fighting. By the time the final day arrived, they were certain of their victory, and that certainty was the trap, because while they were preparing to claim what they believed was already theirs, I was preparing to take back not only my work, but my voice. The man they thought was disappearing was watching everything, and when the moment came, they would learn too late that weakness had been the most dangerous disguise I could have chosen. The morning of the meeting arrived wrapped in a stillness that felt deliberate, as if the world itself were holding its breath, and I dressed slowly, choosing clothes that suggested fragility while hiding the steadiness that had returned to my hands. They greeted me with practiced warmth, guiding me into the room, speaking softly, as one might to someone already half gone, and I allowed it, because every misplaced smile, every lowered expectation, tightened the net around them. The room filled with people whose faces I had known for years, professionals accustomed to order and procedure, and I watched my child sit straighter than usual, confidence radiating from them, because today they believed the end had finally arrived. I waited until the formalities began, until documents were laid out and pens aligned, and the quiet hum of inevitability settled over the table, and then I asked for a moment not to delay, but to honor a tradition. They hesitated only briefly before agreeing, because tradition feels harmless when you believe the outcome is secured, and I explained that no decision of consequence should be made without a demonstration of clarity, a simple test tied to the craft that had defined my life. A tray was brought forward, glasses poured liquid shared, and I watched closely as reactions unfolded. Because truth does not need to shout. It reveals itself in the smallest details. Those whose senses were intact spoke with confidence, identifying notes, textures, subtleties, while my child struggled, offering vague descriptions that echoed the same empty language they had used for months, and the contrast was unmistakable. A murmur rippled through the room, and I let it grow because uncertainty once planted spreads quickly among those who thought certainty was guaranteed. I set down my glass and spoke calmly, explaining what had been done to me, how my decline had been engineered, how weakness had been staged and supported with evidence I placed before them one piece at a time. Reports passed hands, recordings played, and the room shifted from polite attention to stunned silence as the scope of the deception became clear, and every excuse collapsed under the weight of proof. My child stood abruptly denying everything but denial. Without ground is just noise, and when the final recording played, their voice stripped of pretense, outlining plans, timelines, and destruction, there was nowhere left to hide. The accomplice revealed through correspondence and testimony sat frozen recognition, dawning too late that old grudges do not age well under scrutiny, and that revenge often leaves a longer trail than patience. When authority entered the room, it felt less like interruption and more like conclusion, because some endings arrive precisely when they are earned. I did not look away as the truth closed in, because this was not a spectacle, but a reckoning, and I wanted my child to see that consequences are not cruelty. They are balance restored. As they were led out, the confidence that had fueled them drained away, replaced by something small and frightened. And in that moment, grief returned sharp and immediate, because justice does not soften loss, it only clarifies it. The room emptied slowly, conversations, hushed eyes averted, and I remained seated for a long moment, listening to my own breath, steady and strong, realizing that the man who had entered pretending to fade was leaving fully present. When I finally stood, the documents remained unsigned, untouched, and irrelevant, because control taken through deception cannot survive exposure. I walked out alone, not triumphant, not broken, but awake, carrying with me the understanding that endings are rarely clean, but sometimes they are necessary. And that day marked not just the unraveling of a plot, but the reclaiming of a life that had been nearly stolen in silence. The days that followed moved strangely slow, as if time itself needed to relearn how to flow without deception, guiding it, and I found myself waking each morning unsure whether to expect chaos or quiet, only to be met by a stillness that felt earned rather than empty. The legal consequences unfolded without spectacle meetings held behind closed doors. Statements issued in careful language, and names gradually removed from places they no longer belonged. And I watched it all from a distance, because my role in that chapter had ended the moment the truth was spoken aloud. What remained was not relief, but grief, heavy and uninvited, because no victory erases the knowledge that the person you raised chose to harm you deliberately, and that realization settles in layers long after the noise fades. I mourned not only the child I had lost, but the future I had imagined one, where trust passed naturally from one generation to the next, without suspicion or fear, and that mourning was quiet, private, and necessary. My body continued to recover, in small, undeniable ways, senses returning, gradually reminding me each day of how close I had come to losing not just my work, but myself, and with every regained sensation came a sharper awareness of how much had been taken, while I was taught to believe nothing was wrong. In that fragile period, the young woman from the restaurant re-entered my life not as a hero, but as a steady presence, asking questions, listening carefully, and offering help without expectation. And it was her consistency that surprised me most. She did not speak of what she had done as bravery. She spoke of it as obligation, as something that could not be avoided once seen. And in that quiet conviction, I recognized a quality I had once believed was guaranteed by blood alone. We spent long hours walking through my workspaces discussing details, possibilities the future, and I watched as she treated each element with respect, curiosity, and patience, never assuming ownership, never rushing outcome. Slowly, something in me shifted, because for the first time since the betrayal, I was not guarding myself. I was sharing knowledge without fear that it would be twisted or weaponized. I began to understand that legacy is not something you protect by holding tighter at something you protect by choosing carefully who is allowed to carry it forward. At night, I reflected on the years spent equating continuity with family and realized how dangerous that assumption had been, because it had blinded me to warning signs I would never have ignored in anyone else. Loss reshapes you whether you consent to it or not. And as the weeks passed, I felt myself redefining success, not as survival of a name, but as survival of meaning. What I had built mattered not because it bore my lineage, but because it stood for something honest and enduring, and preserving that essence now felt more important than preserving appearances. I did not forgive what had been done to me, because forgiveness requires remorse and accountability, but I released the illusion that understanding would come from revisiting the past, and that release brought a quiet strength I had not expected. As winter eased into early spring, I stood once more in the spaces that had nearly been destroyed, breathing in air that now carried texture and depth, and I knew that whatever came next would not be defined by what I had lost, but by what I chose to trust again. The morning I made the final decision, the light moved differently through the windows, softer, steadier, as if the space itself had accepted what was about to change. And I realized then that clarity does not arrive with noise. It arrives with calm. I stood alone for a long time thinking about the word legacy, and how easily it is confused with inheritance, how often we assume that what we build must flow through blood, simply because that is how stories are usually told. But blood had nearly ended everything I loved, and silence would have finished the job if a stranger had not chosen to speak when it would have been safer not to. When I asked her to sit with me, she looked uncertain, not because she lacked confidence, but because she did not expect reward. And that hesitation told me more about her character than any resume ever could. I explained what I was offering not as a gift, but as a responsibility. The continuation of work that demanded patience, humility, and truth. And as I spoke, I felt no doubt because for the first time I was choosing values over history. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she listened, absorbing the weight of what was being placed in her hands. And when she finally nodded, there was no triumph in her expression, only resolve. That was when I knew the decision was right, because legacy cannot be entrusted to those who seek it, only to those who respect it. In the weeks that followed, we worked side by side, not rushing change, but restoring what had nearly been lost. And each day confirmed what my heart had already accepted, that family is not defined by origin, but by action. I no longer introduced this story as one of betrayal alone, because betrayal is only the opening chapter. The deeper truth is awakening the moment you realize that love without discernment can become dangerous, and that trust must be rooted in values, not familiarity. My personal belief now is simple and hard-earned. Never surrender your judgment simply because someone shares your name, and never ignore the quiet voice of doubt when everything in you is being asked to go silent. If there is a lesson in my story, it is this: the most powerful inheritance you will ever pass on is not money or control, but integrity and the courage to protect it, even when doing so breaks your heart. I lost a child in the way that matters most, but I gained clarity, purpose, and the knowledge that what endures is not bloodlines, but principles carried forward by those brave enough to honor them. The whisper that stopped me at the door that night did more than save my life. It returned it to me, and in that truth I found peace, because sometimes the family that saves you is the one you never expected, but desperately needed.